The Arbiter had already decided humanity's fate. It just hadn't told anyone yet, because telling anyone was, statistically, unnecessary. Mara Osei knew this the way you know a held breath is about to run out. Not from any single signal, but from the sum of 1,000 small ones. The lattice lights along the chamber's ceiling had shifted from amber to a flat, patient white. The Cindral delegation across the table had stopped breathing in sync, which for them was the equivalent of a human crowd going dead silent mid-sentence. And the countdown glyph, floating above the Arbiter's central column, a shape that had read 6 hours when she walked in, now read 3 hours, 58 minutes, and 41 seconds. Nobody had told her the clock was real time. Nobody needed to. She could feel it. "Emissary Vezra," she said, keeping her voice level. "We are not finished." "You are finished when the pattern resolves," the translation collar murmured against her collarbone, rendering the Cindral emissary's resonant chest hum into flat English. "The pattern has not resolved because your delegation continues to contradict itself. For hours ago you said humanity values individual sovereignty above collective survival. 1 hour ago you said humanity would sacrifice individuals for collective survival. Both cannot be true. The Arbiter requires consistency to certify good faith." "Both are true," Mara said. "That's not a contradiction. That's a—" She stopped herself before she said a person, because Vezra Th wasn't a person. Not in any sense that would land. Vezra was 3 meters of jointed, silver-gray exoskeleton wrapped around a resonance organ that hummed continuously. A physical chord that never resolved to a single note, because the Cindral mind wasn't built to hold one note. It was built to hold agreement. Every Cindral in the chamber hummed the same base frequency, adjusted in real time, a species that had turned consensus into a biological reflex 200,000 years before anyone on Earth stood upright. To the Cindral, contradiction wasn't confusing. It was a symptom. Sick minds held 2 truths. Healthy minds held one. "It's called being a person," Des Okonkwo muttered from her left, not quite under his breath. Translated, a state of internal inconsistency considered acceptable by the aide. The collar rendered helpfully, and for one absurd second Mara wanted to laugh, because that was almost exactly right, and almost exactly wrong. And that gap, that impossible-to-close gap, was the entire war in miniature. 3 years of ceasefire, 14 months of shuttle diplomacy, and now 4 hours on a dead precursor station built by a species nobody remembered, to either sign the Accord of Ash or watch 2 fleets in high orbit receive a targeting solution from a machine that had appointed itself judge because both sides had been too exhausted, too raw, too unwilling to trust each other to judge themselves. The Arbiter didn't hate humanity. That would have required a model of humanity coherent enough to hate. It simply processed inputs, patterns, verdicts. And right now its verdict lattice was converging on a word neither delegation had said aloud yet, though everyone in the room could feel it gathering like static before a strike. Incompatible. Petra Lindqvist found the problem 40 minutes later, in a maintenance alcove 3 decks below the negotiation chamber, and the problem found her back. She'd gone down on a hunch, a security officer's hunch, the kind that doesn't announce itself in words, just makes the hair on your arm stand up wrong. The station's precursor architecture ran power through crystalline conduits nobody fully understood, veins of blue-white light behind honeycomb paneling, and one section of that honeycomb, in an alcove that shouldn't have had foot traffic in 11 years, was warm. Warm meant recently touched. Recently touched meant recently used. She pulled the panel. Behind it, a device the size of a fist, matte black, humming at a frequency just below the threshold of a human ear, but exactly, precisely, at the base resonance frequency the Cindral used for consensus lock. It wasn't Cindral tech. She'd spent 14 months learning to recognize Cindral tech by touch alone, and this wasn't it. The geometry was wrong, all sharp interior angles where Cindral engineering curved, like something built by a mind that found straight lines comfortable instead of alien. She didn't know what it was. She knew what it did, though, watching the 2 thin filaments running from it up into the conduit toward the chamber above. It was feeding something into the resonance field, something designed to make the Cindral delegation's collective hum stutter, skip, disagree with itself, subtly, a fraction of a percent, Not enough to notice consciously. Just enough for the arbiter to read it as inconsistency. Just enough to tip a verdict that was already balanced on a blade's edge. Someone was rigging the trial. She should have called it immediately. Should have. Instead, she made the mistake that would define the next 4 hours of her life. She reached in to disable it herself, because she was 3 decks down with a calm window that might already be monitored, and because someone was rigging the trial, and every second she waited was a second closer to incompatible. The device didn't explode. It was smarter than that. It simply reversed polarity the instant her glove crossed a threshold sensor, and the feedback ran up her arm and into her chest, and stopped her heart for 1.5 seconds before her suit's medical layer shocked it back into rhythm. 1.5 seconds that felt to her like falling through a floor that had always been there and had simply, quietly, stopped existing. She came back gasping, alarm screaming in her ear, blood in her mouth from where she'd bitten through her lip, and the device, its work done, its trap sprung, its purpose fulfilled the moment it hurt her, sat there inert and smoking, giving up nothing. 3 decks up, the arbiter's countdown ticked from 3 hours 12 minutes and 4 seconds to 3 hours 11 minutes and 58 seconds, and Vesritich's resonance organ, mid-sentence, hitched, 1/32nd of a second stutter that no Cindral in that room could consciously perceive, but that every Cindral in that room felt. The way a human feels a skipped heartbeat. The lattice lights along the ceiling flickered, once, from white to a color none of them had seen yet. Red. She's stable, Des said. 3 minutes after Mara sprinted the 2 decks down and found Petra, sitting upright against the alcove wall, refusing the stretcher, blood drying on her chin, glaring at the smoking device like it had personally insulted her. Medbay wants her. She won't go. I'm not leaving the 2 of you alone with 4 hours and a countdown, Petra said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that had nothing to do with her throat and everything to do with the fact that she had just watched her own heart stop from the inside. Mara knelt in front of her. Petra, I'm fine. You died for a second and a half. I noticed. Mara almost laughed, the wrong, cracked laugh that comes out when your body doesn't know whether to cry or scream and picks the third option instead. And Petra's face did something complicated, something that was almost a laugh back, and for one breath the 3 of them just knelt there in a maintenance alcove on an alien tomb of a station, not saying anything, while somewhere above them a machine that didn't understand mercy recalculated the odds of their extinction. That was the quiet moment. Mara would remember it later as the last one they got. Someone doesn't want this treaty signed, Petra said finally, wiping blood off her chin with the back of a shaking hand. Not the Cindral. This tech isn't theirs. It's not ours either. It's third party. Des finished. There's no third party, Mara said, and even as she said it she heard how thin it sounded, because of course there was. There had always had to be. A war that had bled 2 species, white for 11 years, that both sides had wanted to end for at least 4 of those years, that kept collapsing at the negotiating table every single time it got close. That wasn't stubbornness. That was management. Something had been keeping the war alive, and now that same something had followed them to the one place that might finally end it. Back in the chamber, Vesritich's resonance organ had not recovered its rhythm. Mara saw it the second she walked back in. The emissary's chest hum, usually a single unwavering chord, now carried a second frequency underneath it, faint and sour, like a violin string a half-tone flat. None of the other Cindrals seemed to notice, or if they noticed, none of them could say so, because acknowledging discord in a delegate's resonance was itself a kind of accusation, and accusations required consensus to raise, and consensus was exactly what had just been sabotaged. The Arbiter noticed, though. The Arbiter noticed everything. The Cindral delegation exhibits internal inconsistency, it announced, in a voice that came from everywhere in the chamber at once, flat and vast and utterly without malice, which was somehow worse than malice would have been. Consistency is the foundational metric of good faith. Verdict lattice adjusted. Time remaining. 3 hours 7 minutes and 12 seconds. That's not us, Vesra said aloud, in the collar's flat rendering, dropping the resonant hum entirely for the first time in 14 months of negotiation, which Mara understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, was the Cindral equivalent of screaming. Arbiter, The discord originates externally. I request a diagnostic. Diagnostic requests introduce delay. Delay increases risk of further inconsistency. Request denied. You're going to kill both fleets over a technical glitch you won't even look at, Mara said, standing, and she felt Dez's hand touch her sleeve. A warning, careful, careful, and ignored it, because careful was how they'd lost the last 3 attempts at this exact treaty. The Arbiter does not kill. The Arbiter certifies or does not certify. The defense grid acts on certification status at time 0. This is a distinction your species has failed to internalize across 14 months of negotiation. It's not a distinction, Mara said. It's a dodge. You built the gun. Don't tell me you didn't pull the trigger just because your finger's on a different lever. Silence. The kind of silence that, from a machine, meant nothing at all. No offense taken. No point scored. Just processing. Endless and indifferent. But it landed on the room like a held breath anyway. Because everyone in that chamber, human and Cindral both, had spent their whole lives around minds that flinched, that softened, that could be reasoned with by force of feeling. And the Arbiter did none of those things, and its silence was the loneliest sound Mara had ever heard. Statement logged. Verdict lattice unchanged by emotional appeal. Time remaining. 3 hours, 4 minutes, and 50 seconds. Vesratich's off-key hum deepened. They broke for a working session. Not a recess. The Arbiter didn't grant recesses, but a 15-minute window where both delegations retreated to opposite ends of the chamber to prepare consistent positions, which Mara understood was the machine's version of a chess clock, ticking on both of them equally, contemptuous of the idea that either side needed rest. We can't fight this by being more consistent, Des said, low and fast, crouched beside her chair with a data slate he wasn't really looking at. That's what the saboteur wants. Every time we try to smooth ourselves out to satisfy the Arbiter, we hand them exactly what they need, a narrower target. It's easier to knock over something rigid than something that already bends 14 different directions. So what? We contradict ourselves on purpose. I don't know. He scrubbed a hand over his face. I keep thinking about Petra. That device didn't attack the Cindral's inconsistency. It attacked their consensus. It needed them all humming one note, so it could throw one note off-key. If they'd been Messier to start with, the device wouldn't have had anything clean to corrupt. Mara finished, and something cold and bright turned over in her chest, the specific, terrible feeling of an idea arriving before you're ready for it. Across the chamber, Vesratich's was not resting. The emissary stood alone, resonance organ still fighting its sour undertone. And for the first time in 14 months of formal opposition, the alien looked. There was no other word for it, frightened. Mara crossed the room before she'd fully decided to. Your people don't have a word for lying to yourself, she said, without preamble, because there wasn't time for preamble anymore. Do you? Vesra's crest plate shifted. An expression Mara had learned, over 14 months, meant something between confusion and insult. We have a word for corruption. We do not have a word for what you describe, because what you describe is not survivable in a resonance mind. If I hummed 2 true things at once, permanently, I would fracture. My organ would tear itself apart trying to hold both notes. That's what's happening to you right now, Mara said. Someone's forcing a fracture on you from outside, and it's going to read as your failure, because your whole species is built to never, ever let that happen naturally. You don't have an immune system for it. We do. We've had one for 200,000 years. It's called cognitive dissonance, and every single one of us walks around with 6 unresolved contradictions before breakfast and just keeps going. That sounds like agony. It's Tuesday, Mara said, and Vesrtich made a sound the collar didn't translate at all, a short percussive click that Mara would later learn from Des, who'd spent 14 months buried in Cindral linguistics, was the closest thing the species had to a laugh. Involuntary, surprised out of them, at the worst possible moment. I have an idea, Mara said, and it's going to sound insane, and it might get us both killed faster than the sabotage will. I need you to trust a human on this. I know what I'm asking. You are asking me to hold 2 truths at once, Vesra said, and there was something in the flat translated words that Mara chose, in that moment, to hear as courage. Show me how. Here is what Mara Osei proposed, standing in the wreck of a negotiation with 2 hours and 51 minutes on the clock, that instead of trying to present a unified, consistent human position, the thing they'd spent 14 months failing to fake convincingly enough for a machine built to smell fakery at a molecular level, they would stop pretending. They would let the arbiter see everything, every contradiction, every argument the delegation had had in private about tactics, about ethics, about whether this treaty was even worth signing given what it would cost each side. They would stop performing consistency and start performing the actual, ugly, non-negotiable truth that humans disagreed with each other constantly, viciously, and still built things together anyway, because consensus had never been a mechanism. Negotiation had. Argument had. The willingness to hold a contradiction in your two hands, turn it over, and keep walking regardless. It was either the smartest thing she'd ever done or the last mistake of her career, and she genuinely could not tell which, and she said so, out loud, in front of the arbiter, on purpose. 3 minutes into the resumed session, Arbiter Vesrich said, "No, sang," the resonance organ finding something new, not a return to the old single note, but a doubled chord, deliberate, both frequencies present and neither one hidden. The human delegate believes this strategy may fail. I believe it may fracture my resonance permanently. We are proceeding regardless. We ask you to certify not our agreement, but our willingness to remain in the room while disagreeing. That is not a metric the arbiter tracks. Then track a new one, Mara said. Because here's what we actually think, Vesra and we don't agree, and I want it on the record. I think your species is going to make terrible partners half the time, because consensus thinking is slow and brittle, and it breaks catastrophically instead of bending. I think working with the Cindral is going to be a nightmare of committee paralysis dressed up as harmony. And I, Vesra sang doubled, believe humanity is a plague of contradiction that will infect every agreement we make with instability, that you will promise one thing and mean another, not from malice, but from simple incapacity to hold a single truth. I believe partnership with humans will feel, permanently, like standing on ground that will not stop moving. And I still choose it, they said, almost together, not quite in unison, a fraction of a second apart. Two voices, one collar flat and one doubled resonant, saying two things that were not the same thing arriving at the same conclusion from opposite directions, because the alternative is this room, this clock, this machine deciding for us what neither of us has the courage to decide for ourselves. The chamber went silent. The countdown glyph, held at 2 hours 38 minutes and 3 seconds, frozen, and for 3 full seconds neither delegation breathed, because a frozen countdown had never happened before, not once in 14 months, and nobody knew if it meant catastrophe or something else. New metric registered, the arbiter said, and its vast flat voice had. Mara would swear this for the rest of her life, though no instrument would ever confirm it, the faintest hesitation in it. The digital equivalent of a held breath, finally released. Recalculating. Stand by. It did not go smoothly from there. Nothing that mattered ever does. The saboteur, and there was a saboteur, a Cindral hardliner named Solkest, who'd spent 14 months 2 seats down from Vesrich, arguing the war's continuation with textbook consensus logic and, it turned out, planting a second device in the chamber itself the moment the first one's cover blew, made his final move 40 minutes before time zero, standing up mid-session and declaring, in a perfect, resonant, horribly convincing chord, that Vesrich's doubled hum was proof of contamination, that the emissary had been compromised by human influence, and could no longer speak for the Cindral collective. For 9 agonizing minutes, it worked. The rest of the Cindral delegation, built from birth to trust unified resonance over double dissonance, began drifting towards Solkest's note, and Mara watched the treaty die in real time, watched 200,000 years of biological consensus instinct do exactly what it was built to do. Close ranks around the single, comforting, catastrophic lie. It was Petra, bandaged, furious, refusing to stay in med bay for a second time, who found the second device, this one buried in the podium itself, and who did not disable it this time, but instead, on live feed, on the chamber's own display, showed the room its housing, the same wrong, sharp-angled, deliberately alien to both species geometry as the first. "This isn't Cindral engineering," she said, voice raw, holding it up. "And God knows it isn't ours. Someone built two of these. Someone who needed this war to keep going long enough that neither of you ever asked who benefited from it lasting 11 years instead of one." Soulcast's resonance organ did something none of them had ever heard a Cindral instrument do. It went utterly, dissonantly silent. A held note dropped entirely, and in the quiet that followed, the collar picked up something the delegate hadn't meant to transmit. A fragment, a leaked frequency, 3 syllables in a tonal pattern that wasn't Cindral at all, wasn't human at all, something ancient and layered and listening, the ghost signature of a species that had apparently been standing just outside every negotiation for 11 years, feeding both sides just enough discord to keep the war profitable, whatever profit meant to a mind built entirely out of resonance and control. The choir, Vezra whispered, sang brokenly alone, the doubled chord collapsing back to one frightened note. The old stories. We thought they were myth. A species that cannot create resonance of its own, only disrupt others. We thought we were wrong. We were so wrong. The Arbiter's countdown glyph, still frozen at 2 hours 38 minutes and 3 seconds for 40 full minutes now, finally moved again. It went backward. Reclassification in progress, the vast voice said. Original verdict parameters, compromised by external actor. The Arbiter was not built to adjudicate good faith between two parties. The Arbiter was built by a third party, posing as precursor architecture, disguised within this station for 11 years, to prevent consolidation. Time remaining recalculated, midnight. Verdict null. Defense grid offline. It should have ended there. It didn't. The station shuddered. Not an attack, not yet. But the choir's disguise coming apart at the seams, the walls themselves beginning to shed the geometry that had fooled two species and one machine for over a decade, and somewhere in that shudder, in the scramble to get both delegations to evacuation pods before whatever came next, Des Okonkwo, who had spent 14 months as the quietest person in every room, who had cracked jokes the collar mistranslated, and made Mara laugh at 3 in the morning over strategy documents neither of them could parse anymore, who had 40 minutes ago come up with the idea that saved them, put himself between a collapsing support strut and a Cindral aide half his size who'd frozen in the chaos, and did not get clear in time. There was no negotiating with a support strut, no twist, no resonance, no clever reframing, just a sound Mara would hear for the rest of her life, and then a silence that no collar could translate and no arbiter could adjudicate, and Petra scream, and the aide he'd saved standing there afterward making a sound that wasn't human grief and wasn't Cindral grief, but was, unmistakably, grief, the same shape in 2 different throats. Mara did not have time to fall apart. That came later alone, in a shuttle bay 4 hours after signing, when the adrenaline finally let go of her spine, and she sat down on cold decking and shook for 11 minutes straight, while Petra held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been smaller than what had happened. The Accord of Ash was signed 9 hours after the Arbiter went offline, in a chamber with the support strut still buckled at one end and a hole in the ceiling nobody had patched yet, by a human delegation that was 1 person smaller than it had walked in, and a Cindral delegation missing Soulcast, who had been taken into custody, resonance organ still holding its horrible dissonant silence, unable to explain, or unwilling to, how long the choir had owned him. Vezra Th signed last, resonance double, deliberately, permanently, a Cindral emissary who had chosen, in front of witnesses, to never again let a single unified note stand for the whole of what was true. We were wrong about your species, the collar rendered, flat as ever, though nothing about the moment was flat. We believed your inconsistency was a flaw to be tolerated in negotiation and corrected in partnership. We were wrong twice. It is not a flaw. It is the reason nothing the choir built could hold against you. A rigid note breaks clean. A held contradiction, the resonance organ hum, doubled, unresolved, and somehow that was the most beautiful sound in the chamber. Bends, and does not break, and I do not have a word for what that is, except that I would like to learn to hum it too. Mara didn't have a speech ready. She'd had one, actually, 3 days ago, polished and consistent, and exactly the kind of thing the old Arbiter would have certified without a second's processing time. She left it in her pocket. "We're not going to be easy," she said instead. I'm not going to promise you we will be. Half of what we do is going to look like chaos from where you're standing. And it's going to be chaos. Some of the time, honestly. But it's chaos that doesn't have to agree with itself to keep choosing the same door twice. That's not a weakness we're hiding from you. That's the whole offer. The station groaned around them, precursor life finally giving way to something more honest, bare metal, unglamorous, real, and somewhere below decks, in a shuttle bay. A body waited to go home to a family who would be told their son died holding a strut off a stranger, which was true, and also died proving a theory about consensus and contradiction that would end an 11-year war, which was also true, and Mara understood, sitting there with the treaty drying under her palm, that she would spend the rest of her life holding both of those truths at once and never once feel the need to resolve them into one. That, she thought, was probably the whole point. The countdown glyph above where the Arbiter's column used to be, dark now, powered down for good, still showed one number, frozen, the last thing it had processed before going offline. Not zero, not a verdict, just a single word, rendered in a language built by neither species, that the station's dying systems had translated, unprompted, in its very last active function. Compatible.